It's dawn over Eastern Europe. Sirens scream across Kyiv again, but this time the skies look different. Above the clouds, formations of F-35s and Eurofighters cut through the morning haze. NATO insignias flash on their wings. On the ground, convoys rumble across the Polish border, the flags of multiple nations fluttering in the cold wind. Then the headline hits: NATO has entered the Ukraine war. That's not science fiction. That's what the world could wake up to tomorrow. And if it ever happened, it wouldn't just change the war, it would change everything. So, what would it look like if NATO joined the fight? How would Russia react? And could it spiral into the unthinkable, a full-scale global war between nuclear powers? Right now, NATO isn't officially in the war, but let's be honest, it's not exactly sitting on the sidelines either. Since Russia's invasion in 2022, the alliance's fingerprints have been all over the battlefield, training Ukrainian troops, supplying advanced weapons, sharing satellite intelligence, and setting up air defense networks with Patriot and NASAMS systems. Still, every move has stopped just short of the red line. No NATO soldiers are fighting Russian troops directly, and that's not just politics, it's survival strategy. Because the instant a NATO unit engages Russian forces, the conflict stops being regional. It becomes a NATO-Russia war, and everyone knows exactly where that could lead. That's why NATO keeps repeating, we're not part of this war, even as it ships billions of dollars in weapons across Europe. It's a tightrope walk between deterrence and disaster, a chess game played with tanks, jets, and nuclear missiles. But here's the terrifying part. It wouldn't take much to change everything. A single mistake is all it would take. Imagine a Russian missile accidentally landing in Poland or Romania. Both are NATO members, which means that legally the alliance would have to respond. Or picture a strike so horrific, a city flattened and thousands of civilians killed, that the world simply can't look away anymore. Even worse, imagine Ukrainian defenses collapsing so badly that Russia threatens to take Kyiv again. In any of those scenarios, NATO leaders would face a nightmare choice. Step in and risk World War III, or stay out and risk Ukraine's defeat. And make no mistake, that decision wouldn't be emotional. It would be cold, strategic, and based on one chilling calculation. If Russia can win by brute force in Ukraine, what's stopping it from testing NATO's borders next? Still, as of 2025, the alliance has been extremely cautious. Even when French leaders hinted about sending troops, officials rushed to clarify before anyone's blood pressure spiked. No one wants to be the one who lights the fuse. But let's imagine for a second, just for the sake of argument, that the decision has been made. NATO steps in, officially. Within hours, the skies over Eastern Europe would transform. Air superiority would be the first goal, and NATO is built for that mission. US and European fighters, F-35s, F-15, Typhoons, and Rafales would sweep the airspace clean. Russia's air force, despite its numbers, simply can't compete with that kind of technological advantage. Stealth aircraft, advanced radar, refueling networks, and near real-time intelligence coordination. It wouldn't even be close, at least at first. NATO's combined air power outnumbers and outclasses Russia's by a massive margin. And logistics, that's NATO's hidden superpower. The alliance has practiced large-scale mobilization since the Cold War. Within days, troops could establish protected zones in western Ukraine, and cities like Lviv would become fortified strongholds tied into a massive network of air defenses. On the ground, Poland's mechanized brigades would roll east, supported by US armored units from Germany and rapid response forces from the Baltics. Missile defense systems would blanket everything west of the Dnipro River. It would be a military spectacle unlike anything the modern world has seen, and a global panic all at once. Because while NATO's strength is overwhelming, Russia's reaction would be dangerously unpredictable. For Moscow, this would be the nightmare come true. Since the 1990s, Russian leaders, from Yeltsin to Putin, have viewed NATO's expansion eastward as an existential threat. That narrative has justified nearly every aggressive move Russia has made. So if NATO troops entered Ukraine, the Kremlin would almost certainly frame it as a fight for national survival. And we've already seen how they react to perceived Western escalations every time Ukraine gets a new weapon, HIMARS, Leopards, F-16. Russian state TV starts rattling the nuclear saber. Drills, threats, statements about defending Russia by any means necessary. If NATO crossed that final line, Russia would likely raise its nuclear readiness within hours. Now, that doesn't mean the bombs start flying immediately. Most experts agree that even Russia wouldn't use nukes unless it faced total defeat, but it would mark the highest nuclear tension since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in that kind of environment, one radar glitch or stray missile could trigger catastrophe. Still, in purely conventional terms, NATO's dominance is overwhelming. The alliance's collective defense budget is about 15 times larger than Russia's. It has more more advanced aircraft, precision munitions, and global surveillance assets than any military on Earth. If the war stayed non-nuclear, Russia's conventional forces would struggle to hold ground. NATO's air dominance would cripple supply lines, destroy command posts, and jam Russian communications through advanced electronic warfare. But there's a catch: geography. Russia is enormous. Pushing it back is one thing. Occupying or defeating it outright is another story entirely. The deeper NATO forces move, the harder logistics get. Supply lines stretch, winter sets in. Every kilometer forward becomes exponentially harder to hold. So even if NATO dominated the battlefield, a total victory would be nearly impossible. Most war simulations don't end in triumph. They end in a dangerous, bloody stalemate. And that's where things get even riskier, because in that kind of stalemate, the nuclear shadow grows longer. When you strip away all the rhetoric, both sides are guided by the same grim logic: mutually assured destruction. If one side launches nukes, everyone loses. That's what kept the peace for 80 years, but it only works if everyone stays rational. Russia's doctrine allows the use of tactical nuclear weapons, smaller warheads, if it believes its survival is threatened. NATO, on the other hand, sticks to a policy of overwhelming retaliation, not first use. So if Russia ever used a tactical nuke in Ukraine, NATO would face the single most dangerous decision in modern history: strike back and risk global annihilation, or hold back and risk appearing weak. That's not a theoretical debate. It's the nightmare scenario every military planner quietly dreads. Even a limited nuclear exchange could kill millions, devastate Europe's infrastructure, and send radioactive fallout drifting across borders. It's the kind of event that would reshape civilization, not because it's dramatic, but because it's entirely possible. The shockwaves would not stop in Europe. China would immediately call for peace talks while quietly assessing how to use the chaos to its advantage. India, caught between economic ties to both sides, would urge restraint, and the United Nations would be paralyzed, just like every other time great powers collide. Meanwhile, millions of refugees would pour westward, global markets would nosedive, energy prices would explode overnight, social media would melt into pure chaos, with half the world demanding that NATO strike harder and the other half begging for peace. Inside NATO countries, unity would start to crack. After years of inflation and fatigue, the public's patience would reach a breaking point. Politicians would face the same old question: how long does this go on? And that's the quiet tragedy of escalation. Wars aren't fought just with missiles. They're fought with economies, politics, and fear. The irony, of course, is that NATO was created to prevent this exact nightmare. Born in 1949 to stop Soviet expansion, it became the cornerstone of Western defense, and for decades it worked. The Cold War ended without a single direct NATO-Soviet battle, but the mistrust never really disappeared. When the alliance expanded east, taking in Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states, Russia saw every new flag as another step toward its doorstep. And here we are, in 2025, watching the collision of decades of paranoia, ambition, and unfinished history. If NATO ever entered the Ukraine war, it wouldn't just be a military confrontation. It would be the physical manifestation of every geopolitical fault line since the Berlin Wall fell. So what happens next? Most analysts see three possible futures. The first is what they call the limited war. NATO pushes Russian forces back but stops short of full invasion. Both sides negotiate and the map freezes again into a new cold peace. Ukraine survives but divided. The second is total escalation. A full NATO-Russia confrontation spills across borders as missiles fly, command centers burn, and the nuclear threshold looms. That's the scenario no one survives intact. The third is the long freeze. NATO avoids direct combat, focusing on air defense, training, and deterrence, while the war drags on for years. A Cold War 2.0, colder, more fragile, and far more digital. No one knows which path is most likely, but every expert agrees on one thing. Once NATO steps in, the old world order vanishes overnight, and the real question stops being, could NATO win? It becomes, would anyone actually win? Because a NATO-Russia war would not be about land or borders anymore. It would be about preventing annihilation while standing inches away from it. Deterrence only works until someone decides not to be deterred. Now, before the jets roar and the columns roll, there's one more piece of this story we need to talk about: the legal trigger. NATO doesn't run on emotion, it runs on treaty law. There are two key articles in the NATO Charter. Article 4 is the consultation button. Any member can call for talks if it feels threatened. But Article 5 is the big one. It says, an armed attack against one is an attack against all. That clause has only been invoked once, after 9/11. So, if a confirmed Russian strike hit Poland or Romania, NATO wouldn't just face a moral question, it would face a legal one: obligation versus annihilation. International law adds another layer. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, Ukraine has the right to self-defense and to request help. So, if NATO entered the war at Kyiv's request, it could technically do so under collective defense law. That's the clean, legal version. The political reality is much messier. History loves loopholes, and wars are full of them. A NATO ally, say France or Poland, could move troops into Ukraine independently, as a national decision rather than a formal NATO mission. Technically, that doesn't trigger Article 5, but if Russian missiles hit those units, the pressure in Brussels would explode. Leaders would demand, "Isn't this exactly what Article 5 is for?" A coalition of the willing could quickly become a coalition of the doomed. Once one ally bleeds, everyone else feels the pull to respond. Meanwhile, the naval chessboard comes into play in the south. The Black Sea is one of the most strategically locked bodies of water on Earth. It's governed by the Montreux Convention, which gives Turkey control over which warships can pass through its straits. That means Ankara becomes the doorman of any NATO naval operation. Turkey's balancing act, supporting Ukraine, trading with Russia, and guarding its own interests, would decide whether NATO's fleets even make it to the fight. And even if sea power is limited, NATO's air bases in Romania and Poland can still dominate the region. In modern warfare, you don't always need ships to control a sea. Sometimes jets and missiles are enough. Now zoom north to the Baltic theatre. There's a narrow strip of land between Poland and Lithuania called the Suwałki Gap. It's NATO's lifeline to the Baltic states. To the west lies Kaliningrad, Russia's heavily militarized enclave, bristling with air defenses, anti-ship missiles, and Iskander systems. It's designed to make NATO think twice before even flying nearby. If NATO entered the war, Kaliningrad would become a glowing dot on every radar screen in Europe. The alliance would have to find ways to suppress those defenses without triggering all-out escalation. Tug too hard on that thread, and the entire sweater unravels. And while everyone looks east, there's Belarus, the quiet enabler. Minsk might not need to invade anyone to shift the war. Just allowing Russia to base more aircraft, missiles, and radar on its soil would stretch Ukraine's northern defenses to the breaking point. NATO planners in Poland and the Baltics already treat Belarusian cooperation with Russia as a de facto third front. Sometimes the threat isn't a movement, it's a permission slip. But wars aren't just fought with firepower, they're won with logistics, and that's where the unsung heroes come in. The Polish city of Rzeszów, barely known outside the region before 2022, has become NATO's beating heart. It's the gateway for almost every weapon, vehicle, and piece of aid heading to Ukraine. If NATO formally enters the fight, the tempo there multiplies overnight. And then come the headaches. Ukraine's railway tracks are a different gauge than Europe's. Every tank, every shell, every pallet of supplies has to be transferred by hand across yards of freezing steel. Add in bombed bridges, drone strikes, and winter mud, and you begin to understand why military logisticians go grey before they retire. But even that's just the warm-up. Modern war doesn't just burn fuel, it burns industry. If NATO joins the war, the alliance's factories would have to flip from peacetime to wartime production overnight. Ammunition, missiles, drones, everything would have to ramp up at scale. That means retooling supply chains, reopening old arms plants, and convincing voters that guns and butter might have to become guns instead of butter. Democracies can do it, they've done it before, but it requires more than strategy, it requires will. Even if NATO controls the skies, total safety is an illusion. Drones will still find gaps, cruise missiles will still slip through valleys. Air superiority isn't the same as air security. Cities would still go dark at night, sirens would still test nerves, because superiority is a statistic, security is a feeling. And it's about to get even more complicated because the invisible front lines are lighting up. The moment NATO enters, cyber warfare and space operations would explode. Hackers would target power grids, banks, satellites, and logistics software, anything that keeps armies moving. Space assets would become both priceless and fragile. Communications, navigation, and surveillance would all be targets. No one wants to be the first to shoot down a satellite, but jamming, blinding, or hacking them is fair game. And when those systems go down, so does coordination on the battlefield. The most dangerous weapons in the next war won't just be missiles or tanks. There'll be lines of code. And then there's the information war, the battle for truth itself. On one side, NATO would frame itself as defending democracy and sovereignty. On the other, Russian state media would call it encirclement and aggression. Those dueling narratives wouldn't just fill comment sections, they'd shape elections, budgets, and street protests. In a world this polarized, disinformation becomes artillery for the mind. Inside NATO itself, unity would be tested in real time. Allies agree in public, but negotiate in private. Turkey might open its straits or close them. Hungary might stall votes or soften language to protect its energy deals. Every capital has its own map layered over NATO's. Collective defense is real, but collective consent is the price of every mission. Coalitions win wars, but committees test patience. Even if the alliance tried to limit escalation, there's a ladder waiting for it that no one wants to climb. It starts with defensive measures, air defense zones over western Ukraine, humanitarian corridors, and medical hubs, but every rung comes with a risk. A no-fly zone sounds noble until you realize it means shooting down enemy planes and striking missile batteries on foreign soil. Safe zones sound humanitarian until one side shells a convoy and dares NATO to respond. In modern war, every move to protect civilians brings you one step closer to open conflict. There's also the legal front, and in this war, cameras never blink. Every strike, every explosion, every claim of misconduct would be filmed, uploaded, and dissected. NATO prides itself on following the laws of armed conflict, distinction, proportionality, and precaution. But when the fog of war meets the age of smartphones, even a legitimate strike can become a PR disaster in seconds. Legal teams would deploy alongside combat brigades, because in the 21st century, legitimacy isn't just written, it's live-streamed. Back home, the economic front would explode just as fast. Sanctions already bite, but a full NATO entry would turn the bite into a chokehold. Energy prices would soar, trade routes would twist, and insurance markets would panic. The price of fuel becomes a daily reminder of the war. Voters start asking the question every leader dreads: how long do we pay for this? And the answer, honestly, is measured in winters, not weeks. Beyond Europe, other powers would watch and weigh their options. Beijing would call for restraint while checking its watch. A distracted West gives China more room in the Pacific and more confidence about Taiwan. No responsible analyst claims Ukraine and Taiwan are the same, but everyone knows that escalation echoes. If the global rulebook gets rewritten in Europe, Asia's going to read the fine print. Meanwhile, the modern battlefield blurs with private players, volunteers, contractors, and security consultants. They fill the gaps, but they also blur accountability. Who's in command when the line between soldier and contractor disappears? Who gets prosecuted when something goes wrong? Even in an official NATO war, the grey zones would still exist, just in cleaner uniforms. Behind closed doors, one phrase would dominate every NATO meeting: escalation control. Generals would keep direct lines open to Moscow, announce military exercises in advance, set time limits on operations, and establish off-ramps before every mission. In a nuclear-armed world, deconfliction calls aren't a courtesy, they're survival. But if all of this ever happened, what would winning even look like? Realistically, the best outcome would be this: Ukraine holds its ground, NATO deters further invasion, and Russia decides that a negotiated peace is better than a forever war. Lines freeze, then blur. Prisoners are exchanged. Inspectors count warheads while diplomats count commas. It wouldn't be satisfying or morally perfect, but it would stop the bleeding. History books would call it a ceasefire. The people living through it would just call it finally getting some sleep. Because behind every acronym, every map, and every grand strategy, there are people. A Ukrainian father refreshing his phone, praying his son made it through the night. A Polish medic treating strangers who speak the same fear. A Russian mother who wants her kid home more than she wants a border to move. Wars don't end when the maps stop changing. They end when people do. So, could NATO win a conventional fight? Absolutely. No question. Could anyone win a nuclear gamble? No one on Earth. The smartest war is the one you never have to fight. And the bravest politics is the kind that sells restraint to a frightened public. If NATO ever entered the Ukraine war, the world would see just how thin the line really is between deterrence and destruction, and how strong it has to be to hold. Let's hope it stays a what if, not because we're afraid of the facts, but because we respect them.